Good morning, and I want to start by thanking those who have invited me to take part in this very important conference, and the team that is part of the Center for the Study of Violence here. And I'd also like to recognize and celebrate the 20 years that is being celebrated this year of the Núcleo de Estudos de Violencia. And I'd also like to thank for the comments and to recognize the presence of many esteemed members who spoke on the opening panel and the others who are present in the room. I think that we are ready almost to jump into the discussion and the debate, given all of the very good ideas that have been put on the table already. Let me also begin by apologizing for speaking in English and having to speak through translation for many of you. In fact, I once studied Portuguese for a year intensively back when I was in graduate school a number of years ago. And I greatly enjoyed it. And unfortunately, when I went back to trying to improve my Spanish again, any Portuguese that I had was quickly lost. But coming to Sao Paulo, arriving yesterday, I don't think it took more than a couple of hours that I was here for me to remember how much I love this language. I think Portuguese is a fantastic language, and I think I've just moved it up to the next position of languages I really must return to and learn. Let me begin my comments this morning by trying to provide a little bit of perspective. It's a little bit for my purposes because it helps me to understand the context, but hopefully it will be useful for you as well. In my current job with the International Center for Transitional Justice, it's an NGO that provides technical assistance to local actors, governments and NGOs and victims groups who are trying to grapple with the legacy of a difficult past. And in my current position, I'm required to travel quite a bit to countries such as Liberia, which suffered a civil war with probably a couple of 100,000 people killed, ethnic violence, and almost no accountability for what took place in that war. And in fact, some of the best known perpetrators in Liberia have been elected through public vote to serve long terms in the Senate, in the National Senate. Liberia has had now just completed a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which has been an important but difficult process, but it's not clear that there will be other mechanisms, be it reparations to victims or criminal justice, that may follow. Another country I've traveled to quite a bit recently is Kenya, where they have just established a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It's now in its preparatory setup phase. And this commission will cover 40 years of Kenya's history, starting in independence in the mid-1960s through to the post-election violence that took place 18 months ago, as you may remember. But in the context of setting up a Truth Commission in Kenya, there is virtually no other accountability taking place. And in fact, the Attorney General, who has been in place for 15 years, virtually refuses to take any action against people who have a connection to politically motivated violence. So it's an exercise of considerable frustration, despite the fact that they are making moves at least towards a Truth Commission. Or to name another example, I've traveled to Indonesia. Now, Indonesia has had almost no justice and no truth and no reparations for many, many serious violations, including massacres that took place in 1965, where somewhere between 1 million and 3 million people were killed, not in a war, but in actually direct anti-communist targeted violence by communities against their own. That's never been come to terms with, and in fact, Indonesia, it's very hard to even talk about what happened there. Now, the reason I mention these cases is to remark how often I do travel to countries where there is virtually complete impunity and where there are efforts, thinking, for example, of a Truth Commission, it's starting from almost ground zero, where there has been very little put in place to date, even if many years have passed. And in a sense, I am mentioning these cases especially to put in relief the case of Brazil, which is actually quite different. And in thinking about what is happening and has been happening in Brazil and reading up on recent events, I have been quite struck by the extent of, in fact, efforts that have been underway over the last many years. I don't think this will be news to many of you, but I think maybe it's useful to quickly go through what I understand to be the various efforts that have been put in place. There was, of course, very early in 1985, the Brazil Nunca Mais project, which is internationally still an absolutely remarkable project, although based on official records, was not something done officially and did not come with the acknowledgement that an official truth process would have. There, of course, have been extensive reparations for the disappeared and those killed in the years of the dictatorship, and also a separate process, confusingly to some of us, through a commission called the Commission on Amnesty, but a process to look at economic damages and reparations provided there, for which tens of thousands of people have come forward to this commission over the last 7 or 8 years, I believe. There was, of course, has been a study by the Commission on the Politically Killed and Disappeared, the Dead and Disappeared, an 11-year study which resulted in this very impressive, thick volume, this book that was published 2 years ago, and I know that the Commission chair is here today. There have been civil lawsuits started that are making their way through against individual persons who are accused of involvement in crimes. There's, of course, as has been mentioned, the challenge to the amnesty law, which is making its way through the courts, in the Supreme Court now. In the Inter-American system, the Inter-American Commission has turned over an important case, of course, to the Inter-American Court, which will be decided sometime soon, in reference to the guerrillas of Araguaia. There is this important website, which if you were here earlier was being shown on the screen, some of the examples of the Memorias Reveladas website and project, where there is a call now for further information on specific cases of the disappeared and a public campaign in that area. There has been opening of considerable files, although I know some files are still closed, and some important files are either closed or there's not access or knowledge of their existence or whereabouts. And even this year, in 2009, there have been recent publications of important books in this area, such as the Memory and Truth book, which was just published, and others that you can wander into a bookstore and pick up and read about what happened in the years of the dictatorship. This, in other words, is a very different picture from what one usually sees in a country that is struggling to come to terms with the past. But in fact, in Brazil, there have been important steps taken. In fact, if I told this story of Brazil to people in some of the other countries that I've mentioned where I travel to, I think they would be not only impressed, but they would be fairly envious of the progress that has been made. At the same time, there is frustration that there is not enough that has been done. One could say that perhaps Brazil is missing more of a holistic approach to looking at the past and looking at the whole truth. There has been some acknowledgement. There's been some truth. There is some possibility of justice, although there is resistance to that still. And there has been some reparations. And I'm not trying to discount or downplay these important efforts, But I think the sense, and perhaps what's behind the thinking in the efforts underway, including towards this conference, is that there are still considerable outstanding matters. So what is it that's not yet done? And let me briefly address that before taking a step back to a more international perspective. In a sense, the reparations programs have been still limited. I'll tell the story of Chile. I don't know if this is applicable here, but it came to mind as I was reading and speaking with people about Brazil. In Chile, they set up, of course, a truth commission and provided extensive reparations to the disappeared and killed, close to 3,000 people. But that didn't cover people who were tortured and illegally detained for years. And as the reparations body was implementing its work, I had a chance to interview the person who was responsible for this process, and he told me that the most striking memory he had was, in fact, a woman who came to him and said, "The tragedy of my family is that my father didn't die. He was tortured severely. He is a ruined man. He cannot function, but he didn't die. And therefore, there's no process by which the state recognizes him or provides any reparations for him or for the family." Now, this was repaired in Chile, this limitation, this problem, by creating a second commission a few years ago, about 13, 14 years after the first Truth Commission was created. And the second commission was specifically looking at survivors of torture and those people who had been detained for lengthy periods. And there is now an extensive reparations program which reaches those several tens of thousands of individuals. In addition, in Argentina, there have been efforts to extend the reparations program beyond what was originally targeted at those who were disappeared. And now it includes a range of different categories, including people not only who were forced into exile, but those most recently, earlier this year, in fact, the reparations program was extended to people who themselves went into exile thinking that they were just a step ahead of the authorities and feared arrest. Those people as well receive reparations for the years that they were forced to be or felt forced to be overseas. So these programs in many countries are often evolving over time. And my sense in Brazil is that there has been one very important, or actually two very important steps towards reparations, but there is, I think, some clear categories that have not yet been looked at, both in terms of understanding the whole truth as well as providing reparations. So a second category of not yet done is the full truth, having further access to all files, undertaking a study of how many people were illegally detained or survived torture, for example. Third, I think one must consider not just the acknowledgement of the responsibility of the state, but the acknowledgement and the responsibility of individuals, and giving consideration as to how to hold to account individuals who were responsible for crimes during these years. And then fourth, I think clearly, and this was mentioned by the professor who preceded me on the panel, Dr. Adorno, there, of course, are continuing abuses in Brazil, and there are many people who are working, and I know there have been important government initiatives as well, working to address this. But somehow, in thinking about dealing with the past in Brazil, it will be necessary to link that to dealing with the present, dealing with the kinds of crimes that have taken place, not just in the context of political repression, but crimes against people who are accused of, whether they were actually responsible for crimes themselves or not, they were accused of and caught up in the system of the prisons. How these ongoing challenges and abuses might be incorporated within an effort to look at the full truth of the past really raises the question of essentially the fundamental nature and purpose of these kinds of truth-seeking bodies, which is really not just the truth. It's the truth for the purpose of changing and improving the future in order to prevent these kinds of actions from taking place again in the future. And clearly in a country where years have passed since the end of the dictatorship and certain kinds of criminal actions by the police and others continue, one has to look very seriously at how to confront that question of reform. And how can that be one of the end products of this kind of exercise? Let me then turn to the core subject of this conference, which has been mentioned several times already this morning, which is the right to truth. And I say that slowly because I think, in fact, if we are honest, it's a bit of an odd, even startling notion that there is a right to know, to receive information, a right that is distinct from the right to have justice done. And out of that right comes an obligation on the part of the state to take measures to find and provide this information to families or to those directly who suffered. Now, if I were to return to my hometown in a small town in the Midwest of the United States, and if I were to say to somebody who did not work in human rights that, you know, there's this amazing new development that people internationally, people who have suffered, excuse me, who have suffered serious, atrocious crimes now have a right to know what happened to them and why it happened, I think the natural response would be to sort of look askance and to say, but surely the real desire is justice, not just to know what happened. So we shouldn't assume that the right to truth replaces also a right and a strong desire, usually for justice. But I think the instinctive lack of recognition, perhaps by some who haven't lived through these kinds of periods or haven't lived in these kinds of countries, perhaps is because of the failure to recognize the power of knowing and how powerful that becomes in a context when one does not have that information. Again, I don't think I need to say this to most people here, but the practices of denial or practices of a refusal to come out with information that state entities have in their records and know, and there are individuals within the state that know the information, that can be extraordinarily painful, of course, to families. So the right to know, the right to truth has become a very powerful right and recognized broadly. There are still debates, I think useful debates, about exactly what the contours and the content of this right is, exactly what is it that needs to be provided in terms of truth. However, there are now multiple bodies internationally, courts as well as intergovernmental bodies who have recognized this. And of course, you may not be surprised that Latin America has in many ways taken the lead and developed this right to truth most clearly. Let me just briefly mention some of the sources of this right to truth and where we see this cited, because it's actually surprisingly broad now. People point to the first reference to the right to truth in the 1977 Protocol 1 of the Geneva Conventions, where it talked about the right of families to know the fate of their loved ones. Since then, there has been a citation of both customary law and treaty law citing this right. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights in 1985, even that early, talked about the importance of truth being revealed either through special commissions or through other measures. the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights and the Inter-American Court for Human Rights have both confirmed this in many decisions over the years. The Organization for the American States General Assembly in 2006 and 2007, and this year in 2009, passed resolutions affirming the right to truth. And as well, we see similar citations of this right to truth by the European Court of Human Rights and by the African Commission for Human and People's Rights. And then finally, some global bodies have also been taking this up very firmly. The Human Rights Commission, the UN Human Rights Commission, based in Geneva, first passed a resolution affirming the right to truth in some detail in 2005. And the Human Rights Council, which has replaced the Commission, has again passed that resolution, strengthening it each year in the last 2 years. And finally, both at the United Nations at the most global level, both the Security Council and the General Assembly, as well as in statements from the Secretary General of the UN, have all referred to not always using the terminology of the right to truth, but talking about the importance of truth in countering impunity and promoting human rights. So I think today we can briefly say that I think we're beyond the question of whether this is accepted as the right to truth. And it's more a question of how this is implemented and exactly what the obligations are that are attached to it. I think in brief, the terminology, the language, thank you, that is often used is that it's not just the obligation to provide information about what happened, but also to provide information about the circumstances around the events and the reasons for what took place. In other words, to answer those many questions of what, when, how, why, who, and where. And in a sense, that's the complexity of the questions that a state should be responding to and has an obligation to try to respond to in each case. But I would sustain that it is not just the right to truth that we're concerned with here, but it's the function of truth. Why is it that we are interested in the truth? I would sustain that it's not just because that there's a law, a legal obligation to do this, that we are all most concerned about it. But in fact, that there is something particularly challenging and particularly important about coming to terms with these periods where there has been vast political repression, and that the failure to do so tends to leave a mark and leave unopened business in society for many years to come. I think that we all would like it to be possible for the past to just fade away. But somehow it doesn't. It stays alive. And in a sense, the past stays alive equally in countries that have tried to do everything possible through truth commissions and other measures, such as in Argentina or Chile or elsewhere. You wouldn't argue that the past has gone away there either. But it has stayed alive, I have found, in a different manner in those countries that have not made a serious effort to come to terms with and actually admit to and acknowledge what has happened. Those countries that have tried to turn the page on the past without truth and acknowledgement, and I would point to Mozambique as one case, or Cambodia for many, many years, have found that the past sometimes continues to be used as a political weapon, as has been shown to be true still in Mozambique, or as in the case of Cambodia, surprisingly enough, that there's a strange sense of lack of knowledge and acceptance about what has taken place in the past, despite the vast numbers of people that were affected both of those countries, in fact. I think in the Americas there has been less of an inclination to try to bury the past without acknowledging it. And of course there are many examples that you all are aware of, and several have been mentioned today already, of very important examples of not only truth commissions but many other efforts. And even now today, we have the case of Canada. I said America's not Latin America. Canada is setting up a truth commission, has just set up a truth commission to deal with the abuses against its indigenous population over the last century and the forcibly mainstreaming of the indigenous population and the abusive practices therein. And I should also note there are quite a number of people and NGOs in the United States that have been pushing for a truth commission there pertaining to the last 8 years of the Bush administration and the war on terror. So let me then turn to the specific policy option, mechanism of a truth commission. Truth commissions, of course, are now more and more popular around the world. There have been over 45 truth commissions to date. Some of these have been more successful and effective, and some of these have definitely been less effective and successful. They're a hard process to do well. Each of these commissions is different from each of the others, and they must be crafted at the national level as to what they will look like, what powers they should include, how far back in time they should reach, what the core mission of this body is. It's a decision that must be taken at the national level to have a major effort such as a truth commission, and it must be undertaken soberly. And I agree with the comments that we heard on the opening panel, that this is not something, none of these issues and approaches on dealing with the past is something that should be done either lightly, of course, or without a full recognition of how difficult they are and sometimes how painful they can be, even while trying to improve the prospects for the legacy of this past for the future. It's not easy to look back, and it's not easy to open up these very painful events for public exposure. The 5 truth commissions that I would point to as the strongest to date, and I'll only briefly mention them, would be that of South Africa in 1996 that operated for several years, Peru earlier in this decade, the East Timor, which operated also in this decade, and of course in East Timor, perhaps I should note, it was started by a Brazilian, Sergio Vieira de Mello, who was then in charge of East Timor before a government was set up, had a very important role in putting that commission in place. Morocco, which established a commission which reported several years ago, and Guatemala, which worked last decade in 1996 to 98. Now, if one looks back at the history of truth commissions, one can perhaps classify them into 4 general categories. And I think because there have been so many to date and they've looked so different, I think it's quite useful to sort of mark the changes over time and perhaps put some ideas on the table for you all. The first phase of truth commissions was in the mid to late 80s up until very early 1990s, where truth commissions that were set up were focused on investigating and reporting, but they were much less focused on process or on a public exposure to their work. This would include, of course, Argentina, Chile, and El Salvador. They were focused on acknowledging what was denied, but there was no suggestion at the time that these commissions were set up to somehow replace criminal justice, which is a notion that started to creep in a little bit later. The second phase of truth commissions, as I would call it, were those that were operating in the mid-1990s. I would particularly point to Guatemala, which were much more deeply focused on investigations and in a broad sense of the impact of the violence on community. They were community-based, often reaching very broadly into communities to speak to victims, and they were telling and trying to tell the big picture story about what took place, not just the specific facts of specific numbers of people who were killed or disappeared. They had more extensive recommendations, policy recommendations, and often these commissions started to end their work with multi-volume reports, sometimes 8, 9, or 10 volumes. So you have a report that is this wide on a bookshelf. The third phase of a truth commission are those of which we have now many examples that were more focused on their public nature. They were more process focused, as well as incorporating the previous characteristics about having a broad and deep investigation and looking at the broad patterns. So we have commissions that more likely were starting to have public hearings, such as in South Africa and Peru. Those commissions which had very broad consultation processes before they were set up, which has now become a fundamental, I think, characteristic of successful truth commissions. We have some truth commissions, such as in East Timor, which spawned themselves sub-bodies. So they had sub-truth commissions in various communities and regions around the country, and they had a much more process-focused center to the commission's work as a whole. There is also now, in this time, over the last decade or so, a stronger focus on reconciliation in these bodies' work. Again, which is something that is actually more recent. I know typically the name that we use and we hear is Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but in fact, it's equally possible to have a Truth Commission which is looking at the facts, looking at the patterns, but is less responsible for trying to instill and promote reconciliation. But we have seen many now that have included promotion of reconciliation as part of their work and linked to the truth-seeking part of their work. It has actually resulted in some confusion for some commissions, from South Africa to Peru to others, where they have had to ask themselves, is it possible that we might find truth which may not promote reconciliation if it comes out publicly? And if so, then what do we do? They've worked themselves through that, and I think ultimately they've always decided that they should not shield any truth from the public. But it has been a difficult task to try to take on both missions at the same time. And finally, this third phase of truth commissions has been much more focused on a reparations component, including sometimes themselves incorporating reparations granting powers into their work. Finally, the fourth phase, which I think is where we are now, we're continuing with the broader kinds of commissions, but we're now starting to see truth commissions coming up in a number of countries which are applying the truth commission notion to a broader array of contexts and often much more narrow contexts. So it's hard to recognize them as truth commissions, but they use that name and they think of themselves as truth commissions. So there's a truth commission in Colombia on the events of the Palace of Justice, which you may remember from 20 years back. A specific event-focused commission. As I mentioned, there's a call for a commission in the U.S. on the war on terror, which would be a different kind of body, but people sometimes use that terminology for it. And there are other examples as well. But the idea is not just to use the terminology, but in fact people mean something specific when they call something a truth commission. They're trying to get to the heart of and understand the why questions about what took place, not just specifically the facts. So, and let me try to finish up because time is running. As the complexity of these bodies has increased, so have the expectations on future truth commissions. So now we have quite high expectations when a truth commission is set up. And I think we, as internationals who are trying to assist these kinds of bodies when they are created, I think we must ask ourselves whether it's appropriate to apply the standards of, let's say, Peru, which had a really strong commission and did remarkable work, whether you can apply that level of complexity and requirements to a Liberia or a Sierra Leone, which doesn't have electricity and has very few people with the capacity to staff a commission. Is it possible to expect the same level of results from such weak contexts? Not that the people and the desires are not very strong, but it's very hard to implement it, and sometimes very few records are present. Let me then conclude by noting that I think, as I said earlier, dealing with the past is an extraordinarily difficult task. If Brazil decides to establish something like a truth commission, it will have many examples to study and lessons to learn, both good and bad, from other countries. And it will also have the opportunity, and I think, in fact, the essential requirement, to think very creatively about what such a truth commission should look like for this country. What should the Brazilian model look like, which isn't going to be something that we've seen anywhere else? I think that Brazil is a country to watch for those of us who are working in the transitional justice field. There has been much that's been done, but I think that one cannot escape the feeling that there is much more that may be about to be done. And I think it's going to be a very important and very, very interesting next period of time as Brazil works through these decisions and choices. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.